This is Shirley Jackson, writer, housewife, and master of that most unsettling and uncanny of genres, domestic horror. I say most unsettling and uncanny because the domestic is all about the home, and in an ideal world, home is a safe space. Whether home for you is your house, your favourite table at your favourite cafe, or your favourite person, it's not unreasonable to expect from home a sense of security and comfort. But what if the home is the seat of your worst nightmares? What if your soothing sphere of domestic stability and normality is shot through with the hellish and the macabre? I'm going to examine Jackson's use of the uncanny in 3 short stories: The Renegade, Of Course, and Got a Letter from Jimmy, to understand how her unique brand of homespun horror takes shape. In these stories, Jackson never shouts, never relies on loud plot twists. The menace that thrums under the surface of her stories whispers. And trust me when I say that unpicking the mastery behind Jackson's technique will leave you more impressed and unnerved than you've been in a very long time. But before we get into all that, welcome. I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcombe and this is Mousy the Short Cat, and on this channel we make videos on all things bookish and freaky, so please subscribe if that's your jam. Today, we tend to think of Shirley Jackson as a master of home-centric horror. But did you know that it wasn't actually her chilling, unsettling fiction that earned her fame and literary acclaim? Jackson made her name and a lot of money writing sentimental fiction about children and homemaking for magazines like Good Housekeeping and Woman's Home Companion. According to her biographer, Ruth Franklin, though she didn't love writing in this style, Jackson was well aware of the financial benefits. She wasn't happy with the kind of pieces the magazine required her to write, but knew that, at 1,000 books a story, I can't afford to try to change the state of popular fiction today. And since they will buy as much of it as I write, I do 1 story a month, and spend the rest of the time on serious work, she explained blithely. But are these separate strands of Jackson's writing, the dark, suspenseful fiction and the warm, funny household memoirs and stories, really so disparate? I don't think so. I agree with Franklin that they are in fact profoundly interconnected. Her horror stories, which always take place primarily on a psychological level, are grounded in the domestic. Meanwhile, the domestic tales often need only the gentlest tap to slide into the dark. It's this creeping overlap between the homely, in the British sense of the word, and the disturbing that is supremely uncanny. Freud wrote about the concept of the uncanny at length in his 1919 essay, Das Unheimlich, which literally translates to the unhomely. The uncanny is something familiar, like the home, like routine or a safe domestic space. But there's something a little bit off about it. Like you're looking at the place you feel safest, but through a discomforting, distorted lens. The home in Jackson's works is distinctly uncanny, as the synthesis of comfort and terror is central to its essence. Anything homely in Jackson teeters on the edge, carefully bringing us into a space entirely unhomely, unheimlich, uncanny. The question is, why? Why in Jackson is the home a space of such menace? In 1950s America, arguably Jackson's most prolific decade, women had very little agency. Above all else, they were expected to be housewives and mothers first and foremost. In her fictionalised memoir, Life Among the Savages, Jackson gives us a little taste of this as she recounts her experience at hospital prior to the birth of her 3rd child. A member of staff asks her, "Age?" she asked. "Sex? Occupation?" "Writer," I said. "Housewife," she said. "Writer," I said. "I'll just put down housewife," she said. Housewife first, writer second. Raising a family and keeping house was a woman's duty. Suppress your desires and live to serve. But what if you wanted more? This question is at the heart of The Problem That Has No Name, as put forward by Betty Friedan in her seminal 1963 publication, The Feminine Mystique. The problem lay buried, unspoken for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? After the end of World War II, the men who had been fighting and who survived came home and went back to the jobs that they left. Jobs that the women had taken over, meaning the women were expected to slot back into the role of housewife and mother and to be happy about it. But for many women, the yearning for more persisted. Friedan articulates this in 1963, but as Neil Gaiman writes, almost 2 decades before The Feminine Mystique, Jackson's stories and non-fiction chronicles were already exploring the exploitation and the desperate isolation of women, particularly married women, in American society. This is the uncanny. Attaining everything that you're supposed to attain, a handsome husband, a beautiful home, happy children, but still feeling a sense of dissatisfaction. Or even worse, fear. L.N. Rosales has written a fantastic essay on Jackson's uncanny domesticity that I recommend you check out if possible. I'll put a link below. The essay explores the dread of domestic failure and the intense pressure on women to thrive in that sphere in mid-century America. It wasn't only feeling dissatisfied with your lot, it was the fear of failing at it. What if you find yourself unable, mentally and physically, to keep house? This was something Shirley Jackson wrestled with in her private life. And, of course, we find it in her stories. She reveals the unhappiness and instability beneath the housewife's sleek veneer of competence. Once you look for it, it's everywhere. Characters, mostly women, trapped in domestic spaces that they simultaneously cherish and fear. Husbands they love and resent. Children they care for and are horrified by. The home is the woman's space, her domain, and Jackson shows us just how easily it becomes haunted. Not by ghosts, but by fear, isolation, and the glimmers of a life forbidden. In The Renegade, Mrs. Walpole is haunted and hounded by everyone she meets. By her new country neighbours, random locals, her grocer, and even by her own children. As Rosales tells us, the disturbing and uncanny child is a recurring figure in Jackson's short fiction. Children blithely menacing and terrifying their mothers crop up time and again in Jackson, and not just in her short stories. Look at this passage from Life Among the Savages. Sometimes, in my capacity as mother, I find myself sitting open-mouthed and terrified before my own children, little individual creatures moving solidly along in their own paths and yet in some mysterious manner vividly reminiscent of a past which my husband and I know we have never communicated to them. This is the uncanny, distilled into a sentence. Jackson's children are familiar, they're her children, but they're also mysterious, individual entities that startle and frighten. Children can horrify their mothers. And this is one of the most disturbing features of The Renegade's climactic final scene. But we'll get to that later. Let's deal with Mrs. Walpole's husband, first of all. How does he figure in the story? Well, he's pretty much absent. Not literally, but emotionally. She puts his breakfast on the table like clockwork, to which he responds with a single word without glancing up. What we get is a tense opening scene in which Mrs. Walpole is juggling an array of thankless tasks. She's frustrated, her mind full of unfinished sentences that began, "Don't you think other people ever have any feelings?" or her train of thought is cut off. If there was a sparkling veneer of 1950s home life here, it's disintegrating quickly. The children are going to be late for school. Mr. Walpole is largely silent and unaffectionate, devoted not to her, but to the newspaper. And through all this, Mrs. Walpole strives to maintain a sense of competence and composure. Her internal monologue, tense and frustrated, while she moves through the perfected motions of housewifery, setting down her husband's breakfast as softly as she could. Malcontent simmers just below the surface of this breakfast scene. And this is all before Mrs. Walpole receives that fated phone call. The Walpoles have recently moved from the city to the country, and they have brought with them their children, Judy and Jack, and their dog, Lady. Lady, according to the neighbour on the other end of the phone, has broken into their chicken coop and killed some of their chickens. This event is the catalyst of the story, and the plot follows Mrs. Walpole as she works out what to do. The level of menace in this story is constant, tense, and incredibly alienating. Mrs. Walpole is very much alone, husband and children and dog all absent in one way or another. She's on the outside of a close-knit community, and the story explores this isolation and the threat that lurks beneath social norms and platitudes. Take the woman on the end of the phone. She seems reasonable, even considerate. She's upset about her chickens, but she's not making outrageous demands of Mrs. Walpole. Right? Of course we'll take care of the damage, Mrs. Walpole said quickly.
No.
The woman said, almost apologetically.
Don't even think about it.
But of course, Mrs. Walpole began, bewildered.
The dog,
the voice said.
You'll have to do something about the dog.
A sudden, unalterable terror takes hold of Mrs. Walpole as she realises what is being asked of her. It's this subtextual suggestion that amps up the terror here for me. There's not an explicit demand being made. What we get is a subtle, menacing threat that oozes through the niceties, the apologetic politeness, the mannered back and forth. Look closely at each line of dialogue here. Pay attention to those italicised words. Of course, don't even think about it, but of course, Jackson is showing us just how much this phone call is a performance of social interaction, a sparring match, disguised behind a veneer of friendly discourse. It's my fault. No, it's my fault. No, it's my fault. I'll make amends. No, I'd never expect that of you. Jackson italicises words to uncover their insincerity. Then look at that last sentence. No italics. Here we get to the real meat of the issue, the truth of the matter. The dog. Something must be done. And we all know what that something is. Throughout the story, Mrs. Walpole meets an array of neighbours, each of whom suggest increasingly nauseating and brutal ways to deal with Lady, the chicken-killing dog. Old Man White goads her when he says, "Guess you're not going to have any more dog," and grins while suggesting her husband shoot Lady. He also suggests the tried and true method of tying a dead chicken around Lady's neck until she effectively goes mad with the stench, leaving it to rot until it gets ripe enough to fall off by itself. See, the head, Mrs. Walpole cuts him off and leaves shortly after. The terse men at the grocery also ask if Mrs. Walpole will have Lady shot, warning her that it won't do to have a dog going around killing chickens. The grocer suggests another repulsive solution that involves shoving a boiling hot, rotten egg down the dog's throat, red hot and smelling to heaven, and forcing her mouth closed so she has to swallow it. And, just like Old Man White, he's gleeful about this. He reminisces about the time his dad force-fed a boiling, stinking egg into their dog's throat, and he laughs. Mrs. Walpole is increasingly sickened, bewildered, and upset as people suggest other means of dealing with Lady, like trapping her in a pen with a mother hen who has chicks to protect until the hen pecks out her eyes. This is gruesome, heartless stuff, and Mrs. Walpole seems to be the only person affected by it. Everyone else laughs and grins, which is unsettling enough. But more unsettling is that everyone she meets already knows what has happened. Word travels fast in this small country community, faster than Mrs. Walpole has time to formulate her own opinion or work out what to do, and this in itself is sinister. As she encounters more people, each of whom offer different medieval solutions that amount to little more than the torture of a beloved family pet, she feels worse and worse, sick and faint, all while having to feign some sense of pleasantry to the people who are causing and revelling in her pain. Only one character in the story shows compassion to Mrs. Walpole and offers a comparatively tame solution that doesn't churn the stomach. Mrs. Nash, Mrs. Walpole's next-door neighbour, suggests tying her up with a stout chain and offers Mrs. Walpole some fresh donuts. But in spite of all her seeming kindliness, Mrs. Nash is yet another source of alienation for Mrs. Walpole. She is the housewife who is getting everything right. She, unlike Mrs. Walpole, consumed by thoughts of her dog, can't leave the stove. She's frying donuts for the men, and Mrs. Walpole can't help but compare their lives. The bright sunlight across Mrs. Nash's kitchen doorway, the solid table bearing plates of donuts, the pleasant smell of the frying, were all symbols somehow of Mrs. Nash's safety, her confidence in a way of life and a security that had no traffic with chicken killing, no city fears. An assurance and cleanliness so great that she was willing to bestow its overflow on the Walpoles, bring them donuts and overlook Mrs. Walpole's dirty kitchen. Mrs. Walpole feels utterly inadequate next to this model housewife who, despite complaining that she can never keep up with the demand for donuts, manages to do so with enough left over to donate to her neighbours. Not only is Mrs. Walpole alienated by the men in her community, each more vicious than the next, her insecurities and inadequacies are thrown into stark contrast by Mrs. Nash, whose kitchen, whose domain, the home, is so much brighter, so much more together than hers. If all this wasn't bad enough, we're yet to reach the most disturbing part of the story, the alarming, gruesome climax, the worst and most sinister suggested punishment for Lady. Tie a spiked collar round her neck, pull on it when she runs for the chickens, and chop her head clean off. And this horrendous idea is put forward by none other than Mrs. Walpole's 2 young children. As Rosalis writes, children in Jackson's stories are cast as uncanny aliens who reconfigure the familiar landscape of the home as a Gothic setting, threatening its reliability and comfort. Think of the young boy in The Witch, another story that features a child revelling in the idea of decapitation, and which you can learn more about by watching my analysis, link in the description. Judy and Jack are the ultimate figures of menace. They are uncanny. The way they talk is familiar, laughing and interrupting each other with excitement as children do. It's endearing. But what they're talking about is using a spiked collar to chop off their dog's head. Look at how Jackson emphasises this contrast, how she really hammers home the frightening familiarity of the children's dialogue. And then, when she gets right up close to the chicken, we pull on the rope and, Judy made the strangling noise again, the spikes cut her head off! Jack finished dramatically. They both began to laugh, and Lady, looking from one to the other, panted as though she were laughing too. Italics and repetition leave us in no doubt about Jack's excitement over what comes next. The dashes show us how they're interrupting each other, tripping over themselves with glee, racing to share their idea. That elongated pull is playful and childlike, reminding us that these aren't creepy old men and neighbours, but young children, suggesting such a brutal punishment. This is the uncanny, the fear of the familiar, perfectly exemplified and used to create a supremely nauseating crescendo. And even Lady, the dog, the proposed victim of the scheme, seems to join in on the joke, panting as though she's laughing. This reinforces her innocence, shows that of course she doesn't really know what's going on, but grouping her with the bloodthirsty children serves to isolate Mrs. Walpole even further. In this backwards, brutal and cold community, even the dog, sentenced to death, is somehow against her. Mrs. Walpole looked at them, at her 2 children with their hard hands and their sunburned faces laughing together, their dog with blood still on her legs laughing with them. She leaves the room, tries to compose herself, but feels the sharp points closing in on her throat. As Rosalis writes, though Mrs. Walpole tries to persuade herself that children don't realise that death is never real to them, her sensible thought is overpowered by the threatening unruliness of the children. There is real terror here. Imagine being this frightened and disturbed by your own children. Imagine looking out onto the beautiful countryside and being overwhelmed by the prospect of your own metaphorical execution. Inside, her unkempt kitchen has become a literal and figurative bloodbath. Her children and her dog are detached and maniacal. In this story, the normalcy, the security of the home, the domestic comfort and the fulfilled happy housewife are supplanted by a reality that is nothing short of Gothic horror. Do you agree with this Gothic estimation of the renegade? Let me know your interpretations in the comments below. Consider the Gothic, and you'll likely think of young heroines, cruel villains, foreboding castles and dark, mountainous settings. Jackson's Gothic is not that. This is the domestic Gothic. Rather than frightened heroines fleeing their captors, Jackson gives us characters for whom escape is impossible because the horror is in that which makes up the home. The women in so many of Jackson's stories are alone, depressed and frightened, and their husbands are absent. But what if your husband isn't simply absent, but worryingly malicious? Or what if he somehow manages to be both these things? In The Renegade, Mr. Walpole is detached and mostly absent. But in our second story, of course, we're introduced to Mr. Harris, who, even though entirely physically absent, nonetheless manages to threaten, control, and dominate proceedings. Neighbours, eh? The friendly ones who bring in your newspaper, move away, and you panic. Who will be living next door now? Will they be nice? Play loud music? Have giant dogs that will eat my chickens? You see the moving van pull up to the curb and your new neighbours step onto the pavement. Do you turn into a curtain twitcher, passing judgment on how they present themselves? Make strange assumptions based on what they're wearing? If so, you're not alone. You're in good company with Mrs. Tyler, who watches intently the arrival of her new neighbour, Mrs. Harris, and her son, James. She turned her attention to the woman who was getting out of the taxi and was further reassured. A nice-looking tan suit, a little worn and perhaps a little too light in colour for moving day, but nicely cut. And Mrs. Tyler nodded appreciatively over the carrot she was scraping. Nice people, obviously. Again, I'm a bit obsessed with Jackson's use of italics, here used for comic effect. Jackson was master of horror, but she nails comedy too. You can tell a lot about a person from the shade of their moving day suit. Again, we've got those small town mentality vibes, similar to the creepy, close-knit kind of thing that we find in The Renegade, although this time we're looking from the perspective of a woman who is already established in the community, judging the newbie. Now, by comparison, this story is much more quiet. There's no blood, no animal abuse, no decapitation. Mrs. Harris and Mrs. Tyler meet and make polite conversation, and that's essentially it in terms of plot and action. But this story is all about subtext and suggestion, and it's this that really works to unnerve me as I read it. I interpret, of course, as a story about domestic abuse. Mr. Harris doesn't make a literal appearance in the story. He's staying with his parents while his wife and child take care of the house move. But it's his absence that makes him all the more sinister. Mr. Harris commands the situation from afar and, it would appear, rules his family with an iron fist. When Mrs. Tyler invites little James to join her daughter at the movies, Mrs. Harris informs her that James does not go to movies because Mr. Harris feels they are intellectually retarding. We do not go to movies, any of us, she feels compelled to reiterate. As the conversation progresses, Mrs. Tyler learns that Mr. Harris disapproves of the radio and he doesn't allow newspapers in the house. When he stays at his parents', something he always does when they move house, they don't turn on the radio while he's there. He's a scholar, he reads plays, pre-Elizabethan, of course. Oh, of course. Now, hang on. Maybe Mr. Harris isn't abusive. Maybe he's just a bit old-fashioned. Maybe he's just not a fan of all this newfangled technology and print media. A quirky, slightly moody eccentric, perhaps. I think not. This is a man who bans his family from interacting with the wider world, and his word is law. Throughout the conversation, Mrs. Harris works as a mouthpiece for her husband. We don't ever get a sense of what she thinks or feels. She's also visibly nervous. She laughs uncomfortably when she says, "You'll be thinking my husband is crazy," prompting Mrs. Tyler to reassure her with, "Of course not." She explains her husband's dislike of the neighbourhood while looking round anxiously at Mrs. Tyler. She wants to connect, encourages Mrs. Tyler to come over and borrow sugar and the like, invites normal, neighbourly interaction. But she seems guarded, tense, fearful. There's something that feels very sad to me about this. By vocalising her husband's views, Mrs. Harris alienates Mrs. Tyler, pushing her into a state of discomfort. Mrs. Tyler, in turn, can't seem to respond to all this weirdness without the polite but ultimately meaningless platitude, "Oh, of course," or "Oh, of course not." Any sense of real intimacy or conversation diminishes quickly. Mrs. Tyler becomes increasingly unnerved as the conversation progresses. Mrs. Tyler recognised finally the faint, nervous feeling that was tagging her. It was the way she felt when she was irrevocably connected with something dangerously out of control. This is such a telling line that exposes the coercive control at the heart of the Harris family dynamic. Mrs. Tyler's is a hairs standing on end gut reaction, a fear response, something I'm sure we've all felt at one time or another when we can't quite put our finger on the exact issue, but we know something isn't right. This is very much the uncanny. Familiar, but not right. A pleasant conversation threaded through with fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. Speaking with Mrs. Harris brings Mrs. Tyler into contact with the threat of utter powerlessness. Her new neighbour seems dangerously out of control of her own life, and that fear begins to transfer. Mrs. Harris's want of connection persists to the story's end. She's so grateful to Mrs. Tyler, is very keen to grow their friendship. In one final awkward encounter, Mrs. Tyler invites her new neighbours over for a game of bridge. She saw Mrs. Harris's face and said, "No. Well, anyway, we must all get together some evening soon." They both laughed. Wordless, reduced to a look that communicates her husband's unexplained distaste for bridge, Mrs. Harris can only laugh in that polite, uncomfortable way that attempts to lighten the situation but rather belies the desperation and discomfort she feels. This story, like so many of Jackson's, is left in the lurch. We have yet another woman, Mrs. Harris, isolated by her domestic circumstances. We have Mrs. Tyler left fearful and uncertain and with no means of resolving this uncomfortable feeling that has settled on her shoulders. Contrary to the neighbourly niceties Mrs. Tyler had hoped for, Mrs. Harris brings something else to the table, something other than pleasant conversation and the wholesome borrowing of sugar over the picket fence. Someone malignant is moving in next door, and there's nothing either woman can do about it. And here, once more, the uncanny takes hold. This picture of pleasant interaction, of hospitality and friendship is undercut by the troublesome presence of Mr. Harris, who haunts from the sidelines. The homely is made distinctly unhomely by the threat and the uncertainty that he represents. But what do you think? Do you have a totally different interpretation of course? Please let me know in the comments below. Women, powerless at the hands of their community, husbands and children, screaming silently, isolated, dismissed or dominated by their husbands who are largely absent. This dynamic crops up time and again in Jackson, not least in her story, Got a Letter from Jimmy. But this time, rather than left to flounder, our female protagonist sets course to retrieve power, no matter the bloody cost. This story is kind of hard to unpick in terms of what is actually going on. Unlike The Renegade and, of course, the narrative is abstracted by the unnamed protagonist's scattered, agitated and violent internal monologue. There are lots of plot holes left deliberately unfilled. So, what do we know? The story features a man and a woman, who we might assume are husband and wife. The husband, also unnamed, receives a letter from Jimmy, which distresses and distracts the wife. We get the impression that Jimmy has wronged them somehow. The husband says he'll send the letter back to Jimmy unopened. The wife doesn't share this seemingly moderate response, instead fantasizing about tearing it up and sending it back in little pieces. We never find out what Jimmy has done, or how he is related to the husband or wife. What we do discover is how getting a letter from Jimmy exposes the fraught and fearsome dynamic between them. I think this story can be read in a lot of different ways, and please do let me know what you make of it in the comments below. But to me, it offers us a sliver of this woman's psyche. A brief glimpse into the frustration and fear she keeps to herself, that she is afraid to show to her husband, the repression of which leads her close to madness. The story kind of sets this up from the very beginning. Sometimes, she thought, stacking the dishes in the kitchen, sometimes I wonder if men are quite sane, any of them. Maybe they're all just crazy, and every other woman knows it but me, and my mother never told me, and my roommate just didn't mention it, and all the other wives think I know. Her internal ruminating is interrupted by her husband telling her that he's received the letter from Jimmy. What Jackson establishes here, through the unnamed protagonist's internal monologue, is that she's incredibly frustrated, that she's performing the duties of a housewife, diligently doing those dishes, that she's isolated from the men she knows and from the women who she suspects of keeping her in the dark. Once more, we have a woman trapped, alone, and unsatisfied. The story parallels the two characters, the husband and the wife. He routinely brushes off the letter, doesn't seem fazed by it, and she cannot stop thinking about it. "Had lunch with Tom today," he said, as though the subject were closed, just exactly as though the subject were closed, she thought, just exactly as though he never expected to think about it again. Maybe he doesn't, she thought, my God. The protagonist's frustration is really hammered home by the repetition here that emphasises her obsession with the letter with Jimmy. It's all she can think about, and she can't believe he's moved on from the subject without batting an eyelid. This is a feeling that I recognise, being so affected by something while the person I'm with is completely unbothered. And then their unbotheredness in turn inflames my feelings and makes me want to scream, "How can you be so blasé about this?" I think it's this stark contrast that Jackson wants to emphasise here. The privilege, perhaps, of being able to be so seemingly unbothered and to be in control of a situation versus the internal howling that comes from being extremely bothered but not having any agency. Our protagonist is scared to show her true feelings, chastises herself when she almost slips up and reveals too much of what she actually thinks. She even hints at possible domestic abuse. "Open it," her husband says when she expresses a restrained curiosity about the contents of the letter. "Oh God," she thought. Oh God, I'll steal it out of his briefcase. I'll scramble it up with his eggs tomorrow, but I won't take a dare like that. He'd break my arm." She'd rather feed the letter to her husband than open it in front of him. Again, the repetition sticks out here. This time it's the exclamatory "oh God" that emphasises her fear, her disbelief, and the intensity of her feelings. She's reaching a limit. There are no more words. And she's risking her physical safety if she goes ahead and does the thing she wants to do, open the letter. And the fact that her husband invites her to do so seems doubly sadistic. "Go on, I dare you. I'll get you." The only way she can remove herself from this reality is by fantasising about an alternative. Her internal monologue is peppered with different means of escape. Maybe he'll go home and live with his mother for a while, she thinks at one point, and at another, maybe he could kill himself. She fantasises that her husband might actually feel similarly to her, might drive himself into a hysterical state trying to read through the envelope locked in the bathroom. What she absolutely cannot abide, though, is his indifference. Or maybe he just got it and said, "Oh, from Jimmy," and threw it in his briefcase and forgot it. I'll murder him if he did, she thought. I'll bury him in the cellar. And, by the story's close, there's a hint that this fantasy might be leaking out into reality. Her husband's indifference towards the letter is finally confirmed. He forgot to send it back to Jimmy unopened like he said he would. And this seems to sharpen the protagonist's focus. It slipped his mind completely. He never gave it a second thought. If it was a snake, it would have bit him. Under the cellar steps, she thought, with his head bashed in and his goddamn letter under his folded hands. And it's worth it, she thought. Oh, it's worth it. The deliciousness of that, oh, the pleasure she takes in it, the surety of it as the idea crystallises, and the violence of it. I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I've always been aware of this idea that women tend to murder in quiet ways. They use poison, for example. But this is full-on, unapologetic gore. This is a bloody, visceral murder. There's a sense of catharsis here. She spent all this time being outwardly quiet and proper, and now she's at boiling point, and her rage is going to bubble over in the most dramatic and deafening fashion. Now, all this is still internal, of course. The story doesn't end with her carrying any of this out. But, unlike The Renegade and Of Course, both of which end with their female protagonists in stasis, in limbo, unsure, trapped, here, in Got a Letter from Jimmy, our protagonist seems to have discovered a way out. Each of these short stories showcases the deeply disturbing potential of the domestic, the unique horror felt by the housewife, the isolation, the lack of control and agency, the absent or violent husband, the menacing children, the ghoulish neighbours, and the inability to live up to the standard of wifely perfection is central to each. Now, this isn't to suggest that Jackson hated being a homemaker, having a family or a husband. Jackson's memoirs show a genuine love for her home life, and she clearly takes pride in her role as both a housewife and mother. What's most interesting to me is that Jackson treads a fine line between the homely and the unhomely, between what is familiar and comforting and what is uncanny. And this, to me, makes her writing all the more frightening. The uncertainty and the quiet merging of the domestic with the truly horrifying. Mrs. Walpole, Mrs. Tyler, Mrs. Harris, and the unnamed female protagonist reveal the potential hellishness of homemaking in 1950s America. These stories are so discomforting, so disturbing, and genuinely leave me with a pit of fear in my stomach, like something has been violated, like a line has been crossed. Horror, in Shirley Jackson, isn't the stuff of ghosties and demons. It's the horror that whispers in your home, lurks in your nearest and dearest, and creeps in yourself that Jackson so brilliantly, uncannily exploits. I would love to know what you think of all of this. Please do let me know below. Do you have a totally different reading of these stories? Tell me in the comments, or join us on the Discord for a more in-depth bookish chit-chat. Enjoyed this analysis but want even more Shirley Jackson? Check out our video on her most famous short story, The Lottery, by clicking here next.